With every new price hike, you lose a piece of your freedom. Groceries, rent, gas, everything goes up, month after month. And if you have the feeling that your salary doesn't stretch as far as it used to, know that it is not your imagination. You are witnessing the quietest wealth transfer in human history, a cycle that repeats itself every generation. Inflation doesn't just make things more expensive, it rearranges who owns the future. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is as simple as it seems. For most people, inflation looks like chaos. Prices out of control, economies melting down, the system collapsing. But for the powerful, inflation is order. It is the mechanism that keeps the modern economy alive. It is how governments finance wars without raising taxes, and how major corporations pay off their debts. It is how the rich see their assets multiply while everyone else struggles just to keep up. Therefore, the real question isn't, why does inflation happen? But rather, why is it allowed to happen repeatedly? To understand this, we need to go back to a time when inflation was treated as a national emergency, not an economic goal. In the early 20th century, most major economies were pegged to gold. Every paper note was backed by metal stored in a vault. This made money scarce and stable, also meaning that governments couldn't simply print money to solve their problems. If there was a deficit, they either raised taxes or admitted defeat. Inflation, when it occurred, was generally the product of war or collapse, a loss of discipline. The idea that a government would choose inflation on purpose would be unthinkable. But then, everything fell apart. The Great Depression of the 1930s destroyed the illusion of monetary restraint. Prices fell, wages plummeted, and banks failed. The economy froze, not because of inflation, but because of deflation. When money gained value over time, no one spent it. Debts grew larger every day. It was an economic death spiral that completely changed how policymakers thought about money. By the end of World War II, inflation had transformed from a fear into a tool. Governments emerged from the war buried under mountains of debt, some owing more than 200% of their GDP. They couldn't pay them back honestly. So they didn't. They let inflation do the work. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, global debt quietly decreased, not because nations got richer, but because the value of the debt dissipated. $1 trillion in war bonds didn't mean the same thing 10 years later. The system learned a lesson. Moderate inflation could solve impossible problems without anyone noticing. Then came 1971. President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. And in that moment, money ceased to be a measure of value and became a policy tool. For the first time in modern history, the world's dominant currency was not backed by metal, but by trust. It was no longer possible to exchange it for gold, only for more dollars. Inflation ceased to be a symptom. It became a feature of the system. From that moment on, the rules of the game changed. Money could be created in infinite quantities, as long as people kept believing in it. Governments could borrow without limits, and banks could expand credit indefinitely. And investors learned that, as long as inflation remained controlled, the real winners were not the savers. They were the borrowers. This happens because inflation silently flips the logic of money. If you hold cash, inflation steals from you. If you hold debt, it rewards you. With every year that prices rise, the real value of what you owe decreases. A $1 million mortgage today might seem crushing, but in 20 years, after stable inflation, that same debt will seem lighter. Meanwhile, your assets, your house, your stocks, your land, all increase in nominal value. Inflation doesn't just reduce debt, it amplifies wealth. This is the paradox at the heart of the system. The same force that destroys the poor sustains the rich, and it is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. Inflation is the mechanism that allows a debt-based economy to survive. Without it, every dollar owed would have to be paid back in dollars, with the same value they had when they were borrowed. An impossible task when the system itself is built on credit expansion. So governments, central banks, and corporations silently agreed. Better to let the currency lose a little value each year than to let the system enter total collapse. But what happens to the average person in this arrangement? The answer is simple and devastating. Wages rarely keep up with the pace. Prices rise faster than earnings. Savings, once the foundation of middle-class security, become a slow-motion loss. And people who cannot buy assets, who live on labor income instead of capital, find themselves running on an invisible treadmill that never stops. Because inflation rewards ownership, not work, and it punishes caution. It turns frugality, once a virtue, into a liability. The system tells you to save, but penalizes you for doing so. When your bank offers 3% interest, but inflation is at 6%, you aren't winning. You are paying to keep your money sitting still. Meanwhile, people who take out loans at 4% to buy real estate see the value of their assets rise by double digits. This isn't market luck. This is the principle. Inflation doesn't redistribute money randomly. It redistributes it upward. The people closest to the source of the money, banks, governments, corporations, receive it first, while it still has full value. By the time it reaches you, it is already diluted. This is called the Cantillon effect, named after an 18th-century economist who noticed this pattern 3 centuries ago. When new money enters the system, it benefits whoever touches it first, before prices adjust. Back then, it was kings and merchants. Today, it is hedge funds and central banks. Inflation doesn't just change prices. It changes who gets to live above them. After 1971, the logic of money inverted forever. What once punished excessive spending began to reward it. What once disciplined governments began to liberate them. And as credit replaced savings, inflation became the silent glue holding everything together. In the 1980s and 1990s, the system had perfected its balance. Central banks promised price stability, targeting inflation of about 2%, enough to keep the economy expanding without the public noticing the silent tax. 2% sounds harmless, almost scientific, but over a generation, that cuts the purchasing power of $1 in half. The difference is that while ordinary people see their grocery bills double, the rich see their assets double too, and then some. Because when inflation is stable, debt is predictable. And the rich do not fear inflation. They control it. They own the houses that appreciate, the companies that raise prices, the stocks that adjust upward. They own the debt that gets cheaper to pay every year. Inflation is their business partner, a silent accomplice that amplifies every advantage. Governments love it too. Public debt decreases in real terms the longer inflation persists. That is why they will fight deflation with everything they have. Deflation exposes fragility, makes debt heavier, exposes bubbles, and forces defaults. Inflation does the opposite. It hides the cracks, fills the gaps, and silently transfers the suffering to the lowest levels of the pyramid. And the bankers? They love inflation above all else, because it guarantees a world that cannot stop borrowing. If prices are always rising, saving is irrational. You need to invest. You need to chase yield. And every chase means one more loan, one more product, one more derivative. The entire architecture of modern finance, from mortgages to bonds and stock buybacks, is based on the premise that tomorrow's money will be worth a little less than today's. The problem is that the lower you are in this system, the less control you have over it. When you live on a salary, your income adjusts more slowly than inflation. When you live on assets, your wealth adjusts more quickly. And when you live in debt, inflation either crushes you or enriches you, depending on the type of debt you have. A credit card balance is poison. A fixed-rate mortgage is leverage. The rich know the difference. Most people don't. This is how inflation turns knowledge itself into capital. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis should have been a fresh start, a moment to rebuild something honest. Instead, it became a masterclass in controlled inflation. Central banks created trillions in new money to bail out the system, not handing it to citizens, but injecting it into banks and financial markets. Asset prices recovered overnight. Stocks and real estate soared. Wages did not. Quantitative easing, the technical term for money printing through bond purchases, gave the impression of being a technical solution. It wasn't. It was a historic redistribution of wealth through asset inflation. Those who owned real estate prospered. Those who rented waited. It wasn't corruption. It was policy. Then, in 2020, the cycle repeated, this time amid a global pandemic. Governments injected money directly into households to avoid collapse. Demand exploded while supply chains broke. Inflation skyrocketed, hitting 40-year highs. And once again, history repeated itself. The stock market hit all-time highs. Real estate became unaffordable. And the same people who benefited from low interest rates were now profiting from scarcity itself. For a moment, the public thought inflation had returned because of greedy corporations. But this wasn't a new greed. It was the same greed the system had been rewarding for decades. They just got better at the game. Because inflation doesn't choose its winners. It simply amplifies whoever already has bargaining power. Look at any major inflationary period in history and the pattern repeats. In Weimar Germany, the middle class lost everything, while industrialists who held real assets emerged richer than ever. In post-war Britain, inflation silently wiped out the national debt, while savers saw their pensions erode. In the United States of the 1970s, stocks stagnated, but real estate and commodities generated fortunes for those who could buy them. And in the 2020s, the top 1% gained trillions, while the median family was left behind. Different eras, same formula. Inflation is the oldest wealth transfer on Earth, and the most respectable. The public blames greed, politics, supply chains. But these are symptoms. The root cause is structural. We built an economy that depends on credit expansion, and credit expansion requires inflation to survive. The alternative is not stability. It is collapse. This is why, even when central banks talk tough about fighting inflation, their true mission is never to eliminate it, only to control it, to make it look like there is stability while the currency silently devalues beneath our feet. Because if inflation actually reached zero, growth would stop, the machine would collapse. And so, the war on inflation becomes a performance, a delicate dance between credibility and necessity. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates, markets panic, and then, just before something breaks, the tide turns. Because deep down, everyone at the top knows a little inflation is a small price to pay to keep the illusion alive. But there is something deeper than politics here, something psychological. Inflation doesn't just change the numbers, it changes behavior. It teaches people to consume now instead of planning for the future. It punishes patience. It rewards risk. It transforms savings into fear and speculation into hope. In doing so, it creates the perfect citizen for a debt-driven system, always spending, never satisfied, and perpetually in search of a security that can never be reached. This is how inflation becomes a culture. We call this growth. We call this prosperity. But at its core, it is the same mechanism that has worked for centuries, a silent cycle of devaluation, reinflation, and rediscovery. It keeps empires solvent, banks liquid, and the public docile. And once you see it, you can no longer ignore it, because inflation is not random. It is how power measures time. It rewards those who live in the future, those who borrow, invest, and manipulate the flow of credit. It punishes those who live in the present, those who earn, save, and spend what they have. And it forgets those who live in the past, those who still believe that money holds its value. That is why the rich love inflation. And you don't. Because for them, it isn't theft, it's strategy. Every generation learns the same painful truth. The value of money is never fixed. The only question is whether you are the one losing money, or the one deciding how much it is worth. Inflation didn't come out of nowhere. It is the natural consequence of a world that wants everything now and pays later. It is the silent engine of debt, the fuel of empires, the lifeblood of a system that needs to always expand, even at the cost of the people who comprise it. And yet, here is the paradox. Without it, everything falls apart. Deflation destroys borrowers, breaks banks, and freezes trade. Inflation keeps the gears turning no matter who gets crushed in the process. That is the moral equation of the modern economy. Growth at any price. So the next time you hear that a little inflation is good for the economy, remember who it is good for. Not for the worker saving to buy a home, not for the retiree living on a fixed income, but for those who already own the home, those who built the system to ensure it never stops growing. Inflation is not a flaw in capitalism. It is capitalism itself, just running at full speed, running uphill, with your wallet in its pocket. Because in the end, inflation is not the fire, it is the oxygen. And the world we built cannot breathe without it. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers, and I will show you where to look.